Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. King George III is one of the most maligned figures in history. The man who wrote the American Declaration of Independence accused him of tyranny. The musical Hamilton in the modern era portrayed him as cynical, vengeful, and mad, albeit a bit humorous king. But my guest today argues that this reputation is unfair, that King George III was a cultured king who believed in a constitutional monarchy and the limits of power, and who also opposed slavery, while the majority of the men who signed the Declaration of Independence owned slaves. My guest is Andrew Roberts. Andrew Roberts is the author of the book, The Last King of America, The Misunderstood Reign of George III. He joins me over Zoom. Andrew Roberts, it is a great pleasure, sir, to welcome you to this radio program.
Thank you very much indeed, Mitch. It's very kind of you to have me on. May I just say that although the character in Hamilton is humorous, the real King George III, very sadly, wasn't terribly humorous. He had what I call a Hanoverian sense of humour, and so I had to shoehorn gags and stories and jokes into this book.
Tell me what you mean by Hanoverian. This is actually part of an important story about King George III.
Oh, I see. He's had a heavy sense of humour. He only made 3 or 4 jokes in his life, none of which were terribly funny. The least unfunny joke of his was when he met a couple named 40, and he said, "So I suppose together you're 80." But unfortunately, that really was the high spot of his sense of humour. Hanoverian, I suppose, is a reference to the fact he was German, and I remember that lovely old gag from Mel Brooks, which is, what's the opposite of comedy? Germany.
This is important, though, in understanding King George, his legacy in as being the King of England. He was king for some 60 years or so, but but he did have a German lineage, which I think some of us may be surprised to learn about here in the United States, about how there were Germans who were actually ruling England.
That's right, yes. Because of the Glorious Revolution of 1688, in which the absolutist Stuart monarchy was overthrown, the people who eventually became kings of England were the Georges, the first 4 Georges and William IV, who came from the Hanover region of Germany. They were electors of Hanover. They were brought over solely because they were Protestants. And George I was 50th in line to the throne, in fact, but nonetheless he was a Protestant, and also he was willing to be a limited monarch, a constitutional monarch in which his powers were limited in a way that the Stuarts weren't. And so because of that, George III ultimately was on the throne.
And George III is the first king whose first language was English.
That's right, and who also spoke English without a foreign language, without a foreign accent, German accent. King George I spoke no English at all, and King George II spoke it haltingly and with a very strong German accent. So when George III came to the throne in 1760, which, as you say, was to be the longest reign of any English king, people celebrated the fact, as he pointed out in his State of the Union address, essentially his state opening of Parliament in 1761, born and educated in this country, I glory in the name of Britain. And this was the first king for 150 years who had been born and educated in Britain.
It's interesting, and we're going to talk about how he's viewed in history, especially here in the United States, and connected to the war for independence here. But it's also fascinating to think when I was saying how maligned he has been in history, it's not just American historians that have maligned him, also British ones have.
Very much, yes. The Whig historical tradition of the 19th century and early 20th century very much picked up on what the radical Whigs in Britain had been saying in the late 18th century, which was that, which of course ties in with what Thomas Jefferson was saying in the Declaration of Independence, which was that George III was a tyrant. And yet actually George III, as I said, was a constitutional monarch. There's only one occasion in the whole of his long reign where he replaced one government with another that didn't have the majority support in the House of Commons. And on that occasion, when he did this with William Pitt the Younger in 1783, he was vindicated by the subsequent general election, which was the landslide victory for pit the younger against the radical Whigs. So actually, he wasn't in any way this figure that he's been made out to be by British historians.
I think understanding what a constitutional monarchy is important for this conversation. That comes again from the revolution that you already talked about, so-called the Glorious Revolution. What's important to know, I think, is that King George's power was not absolute as we would normally think of a king's power of being.
That's right, but it was very extensive. Although I noticed in the Harvard Law Review recently, I think the last April, it argues that very convincingly that King George III's powers were actually less than the imperial presidency that you have today. The occupant of the White House has more powers than George III. He, of course, had the powers to appoint prime ministers, and that was something that he had 14 prime ministers in his reign, only 2 of which actually were exceptional and impressive, hugely impressive figures. A lot of them were rubbish, unfortunately, especially, of course, Lord North. I say unfortunately speaking as a Briton, needless to say. But he had powers to make treaties and to appoint generals and judges and so on.
The Queen today is seen largely as a ceremonial position. Is there a series of reforms that occurs between George III? Because it sounds like George III had far more power than, say, the Queen Elizabeth does today.
Well, actually, the Queen still appoints generals and judges, but of course it's done in her name by Parliament, and she takes no personal active interest in it whatsoever, whereas King George III did. So the change that comes from active powers to mere prerogative and dormant powers happens with George III himself, especially towards the end of his reign, when politicians got an awful lot more power, not least because he had gone mad. And also in the reign of Queen Victoria, who did also, although she had certain powers and on one occasion did sack a ministry, which had majority support in the House of Commons, overall she stepped back from active political involvement as well.
Was that on her own choice, or was that something that was imposed by Parliament?
It wasn't imposed so much as it became much more difficult, really, for the monarch to make a choice between ministers when you had much more solidified political parties. In George III's time, especially when he came to the power in 1760, came to the throne in 1760, Parliament was really didn't have parties so much as a set of groupings around individuals. They were factions, really, rather than political parties. By Queen Victoria's time, the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party and the Irish Nationalist Party very much dominated their spheres of ideology. And so it therefore impinged on the royal prerogative to choose who they wanted.
Let's get into the American Declaration of Independence. Here's a quote. "The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states." And then they would, that's just one quote, but then they would go and levy 28 charges against King George III. You say maybe 2 of those charges were legitimate.
Yes, 2 of them undoubtedly were legitimate. The first one of those was the 17th, in which it was basically about taxation and the right of taxation. And the second one was the 22nd, which was about Parliament's veto rights over American laws and legislation. And those in and of themselves justify the American Revolution. It's a beautiful document, of course. It's superb English. It's got some Shakespearean prose. It's something that makes you, that first third at least, makes you sort of proud to be human. But then after that, there's the second third, which, as you say, has these 28 charges. And it's impossible not to see in these charges the way in which that Thomas Jefferson was essentially padding out his brief. It was a wartime propaganda document, an incredibly successful one, but the idea that King George III wanted to establish himself as an absolute tyrant, or was unfit to be the ruler of a free people, which was another quote from that, is completely wrong in my view.
Would King George be even the correct person to charge in a constitutional monarchy? Who basically governed British policy over the colonies in the 18th century?
The cabinet, and the leader of the cabinet, who was not called prime minister. That term doesn't come into official parlance until 1868, so a century later. But the sort of primus inter pares there is the First Lord of the Admiralty, the First Lord of the Treasury, who we call the Prime Minister. But he's the man, along with his cabinet and his government, who are calling the shots. Certainly not George III. Now, George III did agree with many of the things that caused the American Revolution. He supported the Stamp Act, but then he supported the repeal of the Stamp Act. He also supported the Intolerable Acts and the sending of troops to Boston. But when overall you look at his record, it's a really remarkable one with regard to not being a tyrant. He didn't send troops to any other city until the outbreak of the American Revolution. He didn't close any American newspapers or arrest any American editors or try to stop the Stamp Act Congress or the First Continental Congress from sitting. He was, in that sense, not at all like the genuine 18th century tyrants like Catherine the Great of Russia, who killed 50,000 people after the Pugachev uprising, or what the Prussians and the Austrians were doing against the Poles, what the French were doing in Corsica, or what the Spanish were doing in New Orleans. So you have to see him as a very different figure, it strikes me, than somebody who, in the 18th century term of the word, could be called a tyrant.
Is this constitutional monarchy at the time in the 18th century? Would this be democracy? Is it democratic? Did we break ourselves off from a democracy? No.
No, it's not. It's not democratic. It has all male franchise, of course, which is not democratic. It was people who had property, essentially, who paid a certain amount of money in freehold property. So it was about one adult male in 12 who had the vote in Britain. And so it's not anything like the democracy that we could recognise today. And of course, in terms of the United States, of course, you also had some 600,000 enslaved African Americans who weren't allowed to own property at all and were themselves property.
And women weren't allowed to participate either, or at least not allowed to vote. King George III became king at a very early age, 22, I believe, 22 years old. And he comes into the kingship during a very important time, and during, I guess, the middle of a huge war, which some historians would consider the world's first world war. Here in the United States, we call it the French Indian War. I think in Great Britain, it's called the 7-Year War. This is something that's happening in the 1750s, and I think in the beginning of the 1760s. And it's actually important to understand this war, to understand what would come later, including the War of Independence.
That's right. Yes, it's a global war, as you say. It's fought against France and Spain, and it ends in tremendous and complete victory for the British Empire, which thereby flings the French off the North African continent. The nearest threat to the American colonies in 1763, by the time the war ends with the Treaty of Paris, is in Haiti, 1,000 miles away. So this understandably emboldens the American colonists to consider independence. And frankly, by that stage, certainly by the 1760s and early 1770s, American independence is the right way for America to go. It's the historical development that is sort of waiting to happen. You've got 2.5 million population. You've got astounding year-on-year growth, something like 7% year-on-year growth. So economic development that's extraordinary. You've got more bookshops in Philadelphia than in any other city of the empire apart from London, and no external threat from France. And so it makes perfect sense for this to be the moment that the American colonists grasp their opportunity to go for independence.
And this would add a significant amount of territory to the colonies, this war.
Well, this was part of the problem, actually, in that it didn't, because the front of to the north of the American colonies was, of course, Canada and Quebec, a French-speaking province, although not under control of the French after the Treaty of Paris, but under the control of the British. And so there was no expansion to be had there. And then in October 1763, the British made a proclamation that prevented any American movement to the west of the Allegheny Mountains, thereby creating pretty much the whole of the American continent as a sort of gigantic Native American protected reserve. And this understandably irritated those Americans who had land speculation in the Ohio Valley, for example, people like George Washington and Henry Lee and several others, who saw that the colonists' chances to expand westwards were essentially being stopped by the British.
Well, was this because of King George III, and was he respectful of, I guess, the treaties with indigenous people, or what was that dynamic like?
He was very much respectful of them, yes, and of course they had, many of them had fought against the French in the war, and they had done this because of promises that the British had made, and the British meant to stand by. And also, and yes, he was his signature was on that treaty, but also, of course, to the north, where the French Catholics of the Quebec, Montreal region were given this their rights to keep their own religion and civil society. And so, what the king was essentially doing was allowing Catholics to pursue Catholicism to the north of the colonies, and many American colonists thought that this was a precursor to the king imposing Catholicism on them, which, quite frankly, there was absolutely no plan whatsoever. I mean, that really would have been a tyrannical thing to have done, but there was simply no plan for this to happen. It was a total conspiracy theory, frankly. And one with no evidence to substantiate it.
Some argue that this is one reason that we have a war of independence, is because people wanted access to the land westward.
Well, it was certainly one of the reasons that some of the founding fathers thought that Britain was no longer the protector of the colonies so much as attempting to sort of box them into the cities on the eastern seaboard. Which was threatening bankruptcy for some of those Ohio land speculators. I think it's worthwhile, though, to point out that there are an awful lot of founding fathers who didn't have any money in any of this and were actuated by different desires for independence. And it did turn out, of course, that self-government worked very well for those people. The next 100 years did see America become the most powerful nation in the world.
But it didn't work out so much for the indigenous people, the native people.
No, absolutely not. Of course not, no.
Yeah. This is Letters and Politics, and we are in conversation with Andrew Roberts. Andrew Roberts is the author of the book, The Last King of America, The Misunderstood Reign of George III. Andrew Roberts, one reason you were able to write this book is because back in 2015, Queen Elizabeth released more than 100,000 pages of documents that were related to King George III.
Yes, it was a very exciting moment for 18th century historians like me. The wonderful Georgian Papers Programme, as it's called, which is a collaboration between the Royal Archives and King's College London, where I'm a visiting professor, had this opportunity to put online, so you can see it. You can check all my footnotes. The 100,000 pages of his correspondence and archives and letters and memoranda and so on, the essays that he wrote when he was Prince of Wales and so on. And this really has been the most fantastic sort of cornucopia for historians. And we are able to see things such as that point that we were making earlier, that there's not a word there's not a sentence in any of these papers which do include, plans and memoranda and so on of any plan to impose Catholicism on anyone in America, or indeed to impose any religion. There were no Anglican bishops, for example, and George III was a very devout and practicing and pious Anglican.
Well, why is it some 250 years these papers were still not released to the public? I mean, they are, I guess, now, starting in 2015, but why before that are they still not available to historians like yourself?
Oh no, they were available if you go to Windsor Castle and you go to the Round Tower at Windsor, and you go up to the Royal Archives up at the top of that wonderful medieval tower. It's just that compared to the number of people who can just go online and read them just like that, and of course what it did mean was that in the shutdown, in the lockdown, I was able to do research in the Royal Archives without going to the Royal Archives, and that was that's a huge difference, as you can imagine. It meant that I could essentially research this book from home for the first time. So
The Last King of America is a product of the pandemic. You're not the first person I've had on to say so about their work.
It's I mean, obviously it's been an absolutely dreadful time for everybody, but for historians who were lucky enough to have the Queen make their papers available, it was less bad than it could have been. And also, it was a big time for book buying. A lot of people read those books that they've had sat by on their bedside table, those long, heavy books that they've always said one day they'll read, maybe when they break their leg or something, and read it in hospital. But that's actually happened during lockdown, and I think this sort of explosion of interest in non-fiction has been partly down to that. Can I just say one other thing about the papers, which will involve me quoting one sentence, but only one sentence, although it's a long one. George III, when he was Prince of Wales, was made to write large numbers of essays. This was in the 1750s by his governor, the Earl of Bute. And the Earl of Bute Lord Bute was a very intelligent and educated man. He was later made Prime Minister by George III and turned out to be a completely useless Prime Minister. However, he was a very good governor. And one of the essays that I came across in the course of my research in the lockdown was this extraordinary essay in which George III takes apart every one of the arguments made for slavery. And in the course of it, he's writing a commentary on the essays of the Laws by Montesquieu. And in the course of it, he says, "What shall we say for a European traffic in black slaves? The very reasons urged for it will be perhaps sufficient to make us hold such practice in execration. For an inhuman custom, wantonly practiced by the most enlightened, polite nations in the world, there is no occasion to answer them, for they stand self-condemned." And yet, for years, for centuries now, George III has been put on a sort of lower moral plane than the signatories of the Declaration of Independence, 41 out of the 56 of whom owned slaves, whereas George III never owned, bought or sold a slave in his life. He never invested in those companies that did that, and he signed into law the legislation that abolished the slave trade. So I think it's a good time now to have another look at him.
He did not end slavery himself, though, and Grant, I'm recognizing what you just said about, I think it's 1807 when he'd signed the law that ended the slave trade. I think the United States would do it the very next year as well. So I don't know how uncommon that is.
Well, it's unfortunate that he was a constitutional monarch in this regard, because he went along with what the majority of the House of Commons and House of Lords wanted, which was not to abolish slavery until 1833, which, is monstrous that there should have been 26 years between the end of the slave trade and the end of slavery in Britain, or at least in the British colonies. Of course, in Britain, it had been abolished by Magna Carta in 1215, and that was underlined by the Mansfield Judgment in 1772, whereby any escaped slave automatically became free on reaching British soil.
That's the Somerset decision.
The Somerset decision, precisely. Yes, exactly. Stuart versus Somerset, and this was one of the unfortunate and tragic, ultimately, other sides of the fact that George regarded himself as a constitutional and limited monarch, rather than somebody who could put his sort of views and thoughts into action.
Could he have? Was this a personal choice at this time? Was the power of the king, if the power wanted to come in and be able to make such a move, could or couldn't it?
No, because of the Glorious Revolution, kings were not able to overthrow the settled will of the political order, let alone essentially the Whig oligarchy that had been in control of the country for 80 years before he became king.
The Somerset decision is an important historical decision. Again, as you indicated, this is, if I recall correctly, somebody who was in the colonies came back to London, brought an enslaved person with them. That person escaped. This is Somerset, and then he goes to court to get his freedom, and he's granted that freedom. This is the Somerset case. I think this is right around the time my time may be all off on this. This is off the top of my head, but is this all within King George III's rule, or if not, it must be really close to it?
No, very, very much so. Yes, It's in 1772. The king's been on the throne for 12 years, and so Stuart, the slave owner, attempted to put Somerset, the man called Somerset, the slave, back into his property, and this was thrown out by Lord Mansfield in this very important judgment.
How did King George respond to that decision? How did England in general respond to that decision?
We don't know about the king, because his papers don't mention the Somerset decision, and it's very strange actually. There are lots of very important moments. His papers don't mention what he thought of, or even that he even read the Declaration of Independence. I don't believe he did read it, in fact. But unfortunately, we don't have his response to the Somerset decision either. But overall, it was welcomed in Britain, because essentially it did underline the common law view that ever since Magna Carta, there was no such thing as serfdom or slavery in Britain itself. Although, of course, we did have it in the colonies, and there was no. And this is one of the horrors, really, of this whole period, is that nobody seemed to be willing to think about coming up with some alternative economic model whereby sugar could be manufactured in the West Indies without this appalling incubus of slavery.
There is a line of thought on the American War for Independence. We talked earlier about perhaps for some an interest in a war for independence was in land, getting and obtaining and speculating on land, going westward. There's another thought out there that also a part of this was slavery, that after the Somerset decision, that the writing was on the wall of what direction England was moving in towards slavery, and hence, especially from a Southern politicians, also was an incentive for them to join a war for independence.
Yes, I have read this, of course, and it seems to be a very important aspect of the 1619 project of the New York Times. But there certainly wasn't anything in the King's papers, these 100,000 pages, that imply that there were any plans whatsoever on behalf of the British to extend the Mansfield judgment beyond Great Britain itself, i.e., to the West Indies or to the American colonies. That doesn't mean, of course, that the Southern slave owners might not have worried about it, in the same way that there were no plans to establish Catholicism in America, but a lot of the low church dissenters, Presbyterians and so on in the American colonies also worried about that. But frankly and tragically, there were no plans to do such a thing.
That's interesting. And as you point out, though, 26 of the 28 charges against the king were somewhat made up anyways.
Yes, I mean, there were lots of ex post facto rationalizations in there, whereby the king is essentially accused of things that had happened after the American Revolution had broken out. And so that makes up a large number of them. Some of them, I go into this in some detail in chapter 13 of my book. Some of them were just complete fantasies. He's accused of taking people abroad for trial across the oceans, and there was not a single American who was taken abroad at all in the whole reign of George III. Some of the things he's accused of, such as navigation acts, took place in the time of Oliver Cromwell, and they go back 100 years or more. Some of these things that he's personally accused of usurping power and so on. So, as I say, when you take them individually, going one by one, an awful lot of them, frankly, fall to the ground and certainly don't prove him to be a tyrant. But these two, the one about taxation and the one about vetoing laws, do in and of themselves justify the American Revolution.
My understanding is you have signed up for a Google News alert for King George III, and every day you receive nothing but negative news about him.
Every day for the last 3 years, there has not been a single day in the last 3 years where there hasn't been something that has been negative in some American newspaper or website or so on. He's a dictator, he's a despot, he's a tyrant, you name it. And virtually nothing. Indeed, I can hardly remember anything that's been said that's positive about him. So I completely understand if this book is considered to be revisionist. I don't think of myself as a revisionist historian. I do think of myself just as a sort of independent, objective historian. But in the American terms, as far as George III is concerned, I think it probably is revisionist. I saw the other day that your National Archives has put a trigger warning on the Declaration of Independence and has called it biased, outdated and prejudiced. Well, with regard to what it says about George III, it most certainly is, in my view, biased, outdated and prejudiced.
Do you think this is sort of a normal thing to happen, though, as you are coming up with reasons for war? I mean,
of course, yes. It's wartime propaganda. I mean, there's no nation on earth that wouldn't try to blacken the name of the head of state of its enemy in a war when blood is being shed and you're fighting for your independence. So, I mean, another classic example, of course, is Tom Paine and Common Sense, his the best-selling pamphlet of the 18th century, in which George III is accused of being the royal brute of Britain. And he's made out to be sort of brutish and so on. I mean, this is the man who founded the Royal Academy, who bought half the paintings in the Royal Collection, who played 4 musical instruments and invited Haydn and Mozart and Handel to play, a man whose books form the centre of the British Library, 80,000 books, which he allowed scholars to come into Buckingham Palace and read and work on. He was a founding member of the creation of the great Georgian architecture, where great architects were helped by him. The planet Uranus was named after him because of his interest in astronomy and because he bought the largest telescope in the world. His original name was after him. You know, the idea of him being a royal brute was, in fact, he was one of the most cultured, if not the most cultured, king of England. Is completely absurd, frankly.
Again, he is king of England for over 60 years, much of that after the American War for Independence. How was he seen in his day in England?
Well, it changed a great deal. In the first 10 years, he was pretty unpopular. As I mentioned earlier, he imposed Lord Bute, his former governor, as Prime Minister, who was tremendously unpopular, I'm afraid, because of the bigoted attitude that a lot of Britons took towards Scots. Lord Bute was a descendant of the Stuart dynasty and was Scottish, and this was a time only 15 years after the Jacobite uprising, and he was frankly hated and was constantly being beaten up in the streets and so on. And so the unpopularity also extended to George III, especially after a series of government errors and foolish decisions. And he had sort of stones thrown at his carriage and dirt thrown at his carriage when he would open Parliament and so on. So he started off fairly unpopular. After an initial popularity because he was British. Then he became unpopular. And then later on, and especially at the time of the French Revolution, when people saw the terror that descended on Paris after the decapitation of Louis XVI, he became tremendously popular. And as I'm sure we're going to get onto in a moment, his descent into mental illness, and certainly the moment when he came out of that in April 1789, only 4 months before the French Revolution, was the cause of huge celebrations up and down the country, massive celebrations of the kind one only usually sees in jubilees. So he was very popular by then.
Well, why, when there is a movement to overthrow monarchy in France, its next door neighbor, why would that result in him becoming more popular?
Because the British people didn't want to go down that route, which ended up with 40,000 people being guillotined in the Place de la Concorde and elsewhere in Paris during the Terror. And so they recognised in George III the sort of bulwark of British constitution and the common law and liberty and freedom of expression to a degree. Of course, there was some laws against seditious libel, but otherwise there was a good deal of free speech in Britain, and they didn't want to have all of that thrown away with a revolution that overthrew the monarchy. I mean, the French monarchy, of course, was very different from George III's monarchy. The French monarchy was it was
absolute.
It was absolute. It was like the old Stuart monarchy, really, and George's was entirely different. And George himself was very different from Louis XVI. You know, he dressed as an English country gentleman rather than, dressing up like a Christmas tree like the Bourbons did at Versailles. We had no equivalent of Versailles that was so unbelievably expensive. The king was frugal, financially prudent, dutiful, and so on. So there was no sort of real call for a revolution on the French kind of model at all.
I guess already being a constitutional monarchy would also sort of buffer you somewhat. But I would also imagine just the dynamics of a monarch being overthrown next door would cause many kings to become paranoid and worried about their own reign. Did that happen to George III?
No, I mean, he put the court into mourning for Louis XVI. And one has to remember, of course, that Louis XVI was the king who got the French to join the American War of Independence on the American side.
I mean, they're enemies, long-time enemies here.
Long-time enemies. But he certainly had no sense of schadenfreude over the execution of his brother monarch across the Channel. And as I say, he put the court into mourning, and then did so again when Marie Antoinette was murdered 9 months later. And so you have very much a sense in the king that France is an atheistical as well as regicidal republic, and therefore essentially ideologically very dangerous to what Britain is all about. And he never changed that view, even when Napoleon came to power and made France into an empire.
George III is frequently portrayed as having mental illness, to put it mildly, to put it in our terms today. Do you think he had mental illness?
Oh, undoubtedly, yes. No. He certainly did. But I think a couple of things worth pointing out about it. Firstly, it was not porphyria. Everybody believes and has believed really since the 1960s, and especially because of the Alan Bennett play, The Madness of King George, and the movie, Nicholas Hytner movie, that it was porphyria, because they state that in the play and the movie. That is now not believed by anybody, because the symptoms with which the doctors were given by this team back in the mother and son team back in the late 1960s were immensely wrong. They were I'm afraid quite a lot of it is about the colour of the feces and urine of the king, which supposedly establishes porphyria. But in fact,
what is porphyria? What are symptoms of porphyria? What would that have meant about him?
It's a physiological disease where you show every sign of terrifically awful mental illness, foaming at the mouth, physical violence and verbal abuse and so on. And in its worst case, I hasten to add, there are people with less serious symptoms of it. But all the modern doctors now, including Sir Simon Wesley, who is the only person to have become both president of the Royal Society of Physicians and the Royal Society of Psychiatrists, accept that the misleading symptoms given back in the 60s for porphyria are incorrect. And what he actually had was bipolar disorder affective type 1, which has the same symptoms, the foaming at the mouth and the babbling. At one point, George III spoke for 19 hours without stopping.
A bit of mania.
Severe mania. I mean, it's a form of manic depression, essentially. And the great thing about being able to write this book now, at this period of sort of societal change, is that we no longer stigmatize mental illness. And so historians don't blame, or at least I'm the first historian to write a cradle to the grave chronological history book that doesn't in any way blame the king for his own mental collapse. It was simply a tragedy. Another point to make, though, I think is important with regard to the American aspect of it, is that the king didn't suffer from any attacks between a short prodrome attack in 1765, in which he didn't show those symptoms that I mentioned, and 1788, which of course was 5 years after America became independent. So it was not a cause or involved with the course of the American Revolution at all.
The diagnosis of porphyria, if I'm saying that correctly?
Porphyria.
Yeah. Is that comes from the 1960s, you were saying. What was he seen as mad before that?
Yes, people, of course, knew that he was mad since the 1788 outbreak, after which he had 4 other outbreaks, mostly only lasting a couple of months, 4 months, for example, in the 1788 one. But then in 1810, the day after his Golden Jubilee, he then fell ill, and by that stage he was also deaf and blind, and he then became senile. So the last chapter of the book, I have to say, is rather pathos laden. So yes, he died. He died very sad and mad.
Was he an ineffectual king then towards the end of his reign?
No, they created a regency in which his eldest son, the Prince Regent, became Prince Regent, and then later George IV after the death of George III.
How much longer would the Hanoverian reign continue for England after George III?
For another 17 years until Queen Victoria came to the throne. And some people think of Queen Victoria as a Hanoverian because she was, of course, George III's granddaughter, but others call her a Saxe-Coburg-Gotha because she married Albert Saxe-Coburg Gotha. But I think she's very much a Hanoverian. You know, that was what her blood was, and who she married, I don't think should matter so much.
Having lost the colonies of North America, was that a blight on George III's record for his time?
Very interestingly, not. No, I mean, it was a terrible blight on the politicians and the cabinet. The Lord North was forced to resign, and his cabinet all left government, all but one. But the king wasn't blamed for it, and this was partly, of course, because the British people recognised that the king wasn't responsible for it. He didn't want it to break out, and he wasn't responsible for the grand strategy. The grand strategy known as the Germain Plan, which was an attempt to send Sir William Howe up from New York, up the Hudson Valley at the same time as Sir John Burgoyne came down from the from Canada. They were going to meet around Albany and thereby split off the New England colonies from the rest of the 13 colonies. And it didn't come off because Howe veered off eastwards to Philadelphia and captured Philadelphia instead. And Burgoyne, of course, got captured at Saratoga in October 1777, whereupon the French entered the war in 1778, the Spanish in 1779, and the Dutch the following year in 1780. So it turned into a world war, what was just a continental colonial conflict up until that point, and became next to impossible for the British to win. And none of that could be really put at the door of George III.
Do you think his mental illness is part of the reason why he's not remembered well in England?
Yes, I think so. I mean, as I say, until relatively recently, there was a terrible stigma attached to mental illness, which essentially the people were themselves blamed for it. I mean, as late as the 1950s, a respected historian, British historian called Sir Lewis Namier, could write a book in which he claimed that one of the reasons that the king went mad was because he was forced to have sex with his hideous wife, he writes. I mean, this is the most monstrous thing to say, and obviously completely untrue, and shows perfectly, how until very, very recently, people have been extremely ignorant, frankly, about this terrible illness.
He was pretty devoted to his wife, wasn't he? More so than you'd expect from other kings. Oh.
Yeah, it's an amazing story. It's a really quite moving love story, actually, because he only met Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz 6 hours before he married her, and they had this arranged marriage, and it bloomed into a genuine love match. And they had 15 children. They had lots of interests in common. They had a true love story until, tragically, 44 years after their marriage, when one of his bouts of bipolar disorder led to him becoming physically abusive, and they had to separate, and that was the end of the marriage, essentially. So it's a very sad story, but as far as the positive side of it is concerned, he was the only one of the Hanoverian kings who was faithful to his wife and uxorious and in love with his wife. The whole of the rest of them, and most of the rest of the family, were pretty sort of terrible ne'er-do-wells, frankly.
Andrew Roberts, you are seen as a man on the conservative end of the political spectrum. Here we are on a radio network that's seen on the left end of the political spectrum. You were telling me before we began that. Sorry, can I just
interrupt you there?
Yeah.
I'm on the conservative wing of the British political spectrum.
That's important.
Which is a very important difference, owing to the fact that British politics. I mean, British Conservatives are lily-livered liberals compared to American Conservatives, I have to say. I mean,
You believe in global warming.
Yeah, precisely. Yes, and an awful lot of other things as well. Abortion and you name it. I can't be considered on the American side of the nothing like your ultra conservatives in America, I have to say, I'm afraid.
Well, tell me a little more about how you see that difference between conservatism here and in your country.
Huge. We don't have your social issues as anything like so important. We in Britain argue over issues with regard to taxation levels, the amount that the state ought to be involved in the country. We pretty much all of us, I don't know any Conservative that wants to abolish the National Health Service, for example, our socialised health system. And so we really are. The whole country is very much further to the left than America. So I just wanted to interrupt you there, just in case any of your listeners thought that I was about to, sing the praises of any, I don't know. Let's not get into it.
I think that's fair. I think that's fair. You did tell me before we got on the air that your book had been criticized as being a left-wing book.
Yes, I did. Well, left and sort of anti-American, which is completely absurd, because just attacking Thomas Jefferson for something that he wrote when he was essentially padding out his brief in a propaganda document is not a criticism of everything to do with him. I recognise that it took tremendous guts and personal courage for the founding fathers to stand up and fight against the most powerful empire in the world, and then the genius of them to put together a constitution that has kept a vociferous country like yours together for 250 years nearly is a pretty extraordinary set of achievements, frankly, and one that I, very obviously in this book do pay tribute to.
Andrew Roberts, thank you.
Thank you, Mitch. I've much enjoyed it.
Andrew Roberts has been our guest. Again, the name of his book, The Last King of America, The Misunderstood Reign of George III.